I am so glad to talk today to Bonnie Kristian, who has recently written a book, In Defense of Evangelicalism, a response to its cultural despisers. If you don't know Bonnie, she's the deputy editor at Christianity Today. She has written widely online and in print publications on evangelicalism, on the modern American right, foreign policy, civil liberties, electoral politics, and so much more. She has a seminary degree and lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and 3 children. Thank you, Bonnie, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.
We did decide against doing a live Substack interview because I've completely failed that with Miles Wernst recently. So like, this is what I know. I'm good with Zoom. Well, I have to say, Bonnie, that when I was reading Alan Jacobs' foreword for your book, I mean, he drops this massive bomb. Were you expecting that? Were you surprised? Did you know that story?
I had no idea. And when he sent it over, I started reading it and I was like, like, this is an interesting way to start. And then, I mean, yes, it's a huge narrative twist. It completely blew me out of the water.
Well, in short, he becomes a Christian, has already kind of discerned that he wants to go into academics, but he's not sure whether or not he can be a Christian and an academic. And he can't wait to ask one particular speaker who, after he gives his talk, he stands in line, asks the speaker, "Can I be a Christian and an academic?" And this man says, "Absolutely, of course. God needs Christians in every sphere of society." And this sets Alan Jacobs on the path that we're all so glad that he's on, but he drops the bomb that the man is Ravi Zacharias, who has given him this advice. And he says, I must hold 2 radically opposing truths in my mind about Ravi. On the one hand, that he is the man who sets me on this really important vocational path, and also he's a terrible sinner and has done really terrible things. And I was just wondering if we could start there. What opposing truths do we need to hold in our minds about evangelicalism?
Yeah. It's a great place to start. It's a great place for him to start the book because I think that naming that tension and that need to maintain that tension and not try to gloss over it is really key. So the thing that I feel like I've been saying until I'm blue in the face is my argument is not that evangelicalism is perfect. It is not that it should be exempt from critique. It is not that there are not critiques to be made right now in pursuit of reform. It's that I think that there is a tendency to reduce evangelicalism to one bad thing about us right now, especially that is votes for Donald Trump. And I don't want to paper over anything bad. And I too am opposed to Donald Trump. I don't think he should be president. I think he's a terrible president. But evangelicalism is not reducible to that vote. Even if we look specifically at the point of contention, which is white American evangelicalism today, that is not reducible to that vote. And so alongside the bad, and again, there are real bads, I want us to see all the good. And I think anyone who is in a good evangelical church every Sunday knows the goods that I am talking about. Like, there is real faithfulness there. There is real study of scripture there. There is community there in this like increasingly isolated age. There is service there, and not just inside the church, but outside the church. One really fascinating number that I came across while I was researching my book is that evangelicals give dramatically more. I want to say it was 10 times more, though I'm quoting from memory, dramatically more to charitable projects, and again, not just their own churches, but even to outside, including secular charitable projects, than they give to politics. And so, yes, there are things wrong, but that is not the normal evangelical experience. That is not what we mean when we say we are evangelicals. That is not what is happening in the pews on Sunday morning. And this is something that I like, that sense of feeling a dissonance. This is something I've heard from a lot of early readers already. That sense of like, I go to church on Sunday. A woman at my church was just telling me about this. I go to church on Sunday and like, I look around and I see all these goods, this faithfulness and community and service. And then I log onto my computer Monday morning and it's like, oh, evangelicals are the worst. Like, they're a threat to our democracy. and they're all misogynists and they're all racist, and like I don't know, like how do I reconcile that? And she's not naive, like she knows about bad things in evangelical history, but she's like, what am I to make of this? Should I be ashamed? Should I leave this church? And so she described reading the book as like giving her a sense of relief of like, I don't have to deny the bad to recognize the good and to insist that we recognize the good alongside the things that need reform.
I felt that relief too. I really did. Which, in some ways it's sort of obvious. Like, well, of course there are going to be radically opposing truths, because if one human being
is tens of millions of people,
like we're full of contradictions personally. So why wouldn't the church, the evangelical church, not be full of those contradictions? And it also reminds me, I think what your book is doing is really exposing how facile the critique is that just wants to sort of like level the movement and say nothing good to see here, and you're like, well, wait, hold on for a second. But it's interesting because, if you look at your subtitle, you talk about the cultural despisers, which would sort of intimate like an outsider critique, but we know we have a lot of insider critiques too, and people who are leaving the movement. And I'm just curious what you make of that. How did we come to this place where it's sort of like the people in the family are sometimes the most vehement critics?
Yeah. So I tell a story in the book about last spring, I think it was. I was preparing to be confirmed at my church. I go to an Anglican church, and this is what they do, so I was doing it. And I don't come from a background, as you can tell. I was preparing to be confirmed, and so I was reading this book by J.I. Packer, Anglican theologian, and it's not a very old book. Like, this is not from the 50s. This is like 10 years ago, maybe. And he's talking about the book about, like, because I'm an evangelical, and he's so happy about it, and he's so cheery about it. And I was reading it, and I was feeling like a lot of feelings about it. Like, why is he talking this way? Shouldn't he like qualify it? Shouldn't he explain that he's like the good kind? Like, why is he so chipper? Isn't like, it's a little distasteful that he's so thrilled to be evangelical. And then I was like interrogating that feeling in myself of like, why is this my reaction? Like, I went to an evangelical seminary. I am part of an evangelical church. I am very publicly evangelical already. I work at Christianity Today. Like, no one is out here wondering, is I Christian and evangelical, right? And so, like, I felt that discontent with the identity myself. And so I would say, I think that, it's going to come for different people from different places. I would distinguish, though, that there's maybe two kind of broad ways to get there. One is feeling that dissonance I described between the real goods and the real bads, right? And it is good to be repulsed by evil, right? Like, if you see evil in our history or in our movement today, like, that should produce a response in you. But I also think that there are people who are reaching that place of, I would say, unjust or at best incomplete criticism, because of people who are reaching that place of despising, not because of just reaction against the real bads, but because of imbibing kind of the bad faith critique and downplaying or ignoring the goods that are also real. And so, I think about like Romans 14, where it says, like, do not let what you know is good be spoken of as evil. As much as we don't want to paper over the evil, we also don't want to downplay the good. We should be seeing both and see how complicated this reality can be in the lives of ordinary evangelicals, including, as you were saying, like within the same person. And like, just as one concrete example, I think I mentioned this story briefly in the book. We published a story that I edited at CT a couple of years ago now, from Carrie McCain, who I think you met when we were together one time. It's a story. She lives in West Texas, and you're not so far from the border. Well, by Texas standards, not so far from the border. It's like hours. But she knows a pastor down there who is himself. His family is from Mexico, and he's an American, though, and he is a big Trump guy. Like, he likes Trump's border policies. Now, I don't know if he likes the border policies of Trump too. This article was like before this administration, right. But in general, like, he is on board for the strict immigration enforcement. But he also believes he has heard from God that God told him, like, you have migrants, illegal migrants, coming past your doorstep, and you need to go take care of them. And he does this. Like, he is providing practical care. He is helping them find places to live. He is helping them find places to stay. He is feeding them. He is getting clothes for their kids. And so, like, I am very opposed to the president's border policy. Like, I think this guy is wrong in his politics. He is also doing infinitely more to actually help these people than I am. And so, like, that is in the same place, in the same person, in the same community. And I am asking that we look at both.
But I was just thinking that we, in our cultural moment, we sort of imagine that everybody acts ideologically. Like, that's the only way that you can kind of exist in the world, especially on when it comes to politics. But to think that you could have a certain politics and yet care for human beings, like that sort of like breaks our minds a little bit. I feel like that's such a great example. I'm curious, when you talk about the J.I. Packer book, was your book born at that moment?
Not completely. I was already thinking about it. I've been talking to my editor about it. But I was, I hadn't signed a contract, and I was definitely still wrestling with the idea. Because that helped. And I do still, obviously I'm even more all in now, right? Like, again, no one is out here wondering, like, does Bonnie Kristian identify with evangelicalism? But yeah, I do still worry about reception and about reputation. And I have, like, really sincerely tried to be incredibly careful. Like, I don't want to take anyone out of context. I don't want to, handle their works in bad faith. But I think if this book attracts any kind of attention, it's going to attract controversy. I'm an opinion journalist. I'm not afraid of controversy, but it's not something I seek. And so, I don't want to be lumped in with people who are just, like, always locked in that culture war mode and, like, smearing people they disagree with and defending, like, frankly, evil stuff because it's on their side. So it's not the book I wanted to write. I don't think it's the book I've written. And I hope that readers will see that.
I think so. Evangelicalism, one of the things we're kind of trying to do is define it. And on, obviously we have, like, the Bebington quadrilateral, and you can explain that. But I'm interested to kind of hear you think about set of beliefs versus vibe. And what would you say to someone, because, well, let's just start there, define evangelicalism.
Yeah, so this is like half a chapter, but I will do the very short version.
I know.
No, it's an interesting thing, and it's many people will just sort of go to the Bebington quadrilateral, as you said, which is this set of 4 emphases from a historian named David Bebington. It's conversion, Bible, activism, and cross. And people will describe this as the theological definition. I do think that definition continues to be important. I think that the way it's relayed, though, often is not as helpful if people think of it as just, like, beliefs in the brain, and especially if they think of it as a claim that, like, other Christians don't believe this stuff. So neither of those things are right. So it's not just beliefs in the brain. It's also about the, like, behaviors and the community of belonging that flows out of that. So, like, the obvious example is activism. That's not a belief in the brain. You got to go do that, or, like, faith without works is dead, right? But it's true of the others as well. The Bible, for instance, having a high regard for Scripture doesn't mean anything if you are not, like, reading it, which for evangelicals usually means, like, studying it in community, and then trying to do what it tells you to do. So it is more robust. It's more sociological. It's not just theological. It's about how we live, not just what we're thinking in our brains. Beyond that, I would say, evangelicals are necessarily Protestant Christians, and, like, Bebington would preface his quadrilateral with that as well. So a funny thing that you can find in the polls, and a lot of people think this is just about the Trump era, and it's been reported that way a lot, but actually it goes back to at least 2012, if not older, is that you'll have people who are atheist or agnostic or just, like, a different religion, like Muslim or Hindu or what have you, telling pollsters that they're evangelicals. They're not. Like, you can't.
Crazy. I'd never heard that until I read that in your book.
Yeah. And so the common explanation for this is, like, it just means that evangelical is a political label now. And like generally the follow-up is because of what Donald Trump has done to our politics. I mean, there's definitely a political aspect there, right? Like it tells us something that these people believe that they're evangelicals, that they've made this particular mistake. But no, like, there's no such thing as an evangelical atheist, and like the fact that some atheists have made that mistake does not change the meaning of the word and does not change like the reality for tens of millions of actual evangelicals. To the question about the vibe, yeah, I mean, so we're sort of getting in that direction already by talking about how even like the theological definition, quote unquote, is also about the behavior and the belonging that it engenders. But yeah, I mean, evangelicals, we have a shared culture and a shared history. Like we are together as a people. Some scholars talk about evangelicalism as a discourse community, by which they mean like we are asking the same questions and talking to each other about the same concerns and hopes and goals and fears. And I think all of that is part of it. I'm critical in the book of Kristian Dumais, but she's written about like saying sort of an all of the above understanding of definition of evangelicalism. And I think that's just right. Like we should come at it from all these different angles. And one of the like really big pieces of the cultural aspect of the vibe is just enthusiasm. Like enthusiasm is so characteristic of evangelicals. And again, I think this is something that if you've been in evangelicalism, you recognize like that sense of energy and like we are all in and we are like doing this thing and we're going to be at church every Sunday. Like that's all very characteristically evangelical.
So you can be a Christian but not an evangelical. So just tell them, just so people are clear on this. Who are the Christians?
The other ones.
Yeah, we love them.
So there's, I mean, depending on how you want to split it up, you can talk about 3, or I think it's more common to hear about like 5 big types of Christianity these days. So first 1,000 years, there's just one kind. You know, they're like sorting things out. They're deciding what's heresy, what's not heresy. But you've got the Catholic Church, right? And that's basically it. Around, I think it's 1054. It's about 1,000 years deep. The Eastern Orthodox split off, and so that's the Great Schism. It's the first big division. So now you have the Catholics and the Orthodox. 500 years later, the Protestant Reformation happens. The Protestants leave the Catholics. They actually, interestingly, did, I think it was Luther and or Calvin and an Orthodox patriarch had a little bit of correspondence, and they thought about, like, should we get together? Did not work out.
Darn.
So then you have 3, the Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Protestants. And then in the last 100 years or so, we've started to speak of 3 categories within the Protestants. So one is what we typically these days will call the mainline Protestants. These are folks who tend to be more theologically progressive. They are also more, in a maybe a more flattering description, tend to be when there were denominational splits in the Civil War. These are the northern churches that supported abolition. And so in this day and age, honestly, there are not many mainline Protestants left. Like these are aging denominations. We're thinking about like the Episcopal Church, the American Baptist Convention, the Presbyterian Church USA. There's 7 main ones and some smaller ones as well. The next big group is evangelicals, who we're talking about here today. These are also Protestants. They tend to be more theologically conservative, and there's all these other distinctives of culture and theology, and emphasis and theology that we've been talking about. And then the last group is what you would call the Pentecostal or charismatic movement. The interesting thing, there's debate about should they be treated as their own thing or not, because there's often overlap with evangelicals and some parts of that movement. There's also like Pentecostal Catholics. So that's sort of a special category. It can be hard to talk about. But so yeah, we could talk about Catholics, Orthodox, mainline Protestants, and Pentecostal and charismatic Christians. We have many things in common with one another. We're all Christians. In some cases, like with the charismatics, there's even overlap. With the mainline Protestants, we might have the same words in our denomination names, but that's kind of how we think about these differences.
And then it complicates even further, I guess, sometimes when you even look beyond the borders of the U.S. Like I'm thinking about like Canadian Anglicans who are American Episcopalians.
Yes.
But then you have evangelical Anglicans in Canada. And then you also have Anglicans, I think, who would not either self-identify as evangelical or even be recognizably evangelical.
Yes. And actually, I don't know how widespread this is, but like the rector of my church is originally from Canada, and he uses Pentecostal. He corrects himself for the American audience, but sometimes he'll use Pentecostal the way we'd use evangelical, which is very confusing. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, we're just sort of noting like this is a very complicated question. You know, what does it mean to be evangelical? And sometimes, you know, it's like what is it? How will I know when I'm in love, Mom? Well, you'll know when you know. There's a little bit maybe of that.
Yeah.
Would you know?
I was just going to say, I mean, and this is why in the book I talk about, I think much more useful than saying, is this person or this institution evangelical, like it is or isn't? It is much more useful to think about more or less evangelical. I think that there's evangelicalism is, you know, as we were talking about with like the atheists who say they're evangelical, it's not just an empty label that you can put whatever you want in. Like it has a knowable center.
Yes.
But there are a lot of things that are more typically evangelical and things that are less typically evangelical. And it can be really useful to say like, yeah, I think probably that is evangelical, but like that's not what most evangelicals are doing and thinking. And to distinguish between that center and the fringe. But like even as a means of accountability for myself, I didn't want to just like say, you know, I don't like that guy. I guess I'm going to say he's not an evangelical. And it might be accurate to say I think he's less characteristic, but that's a different thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this kind of gets to the question, I thought the more or less was very helpful, but I'm curious, like when the fringe maybe takes over the center and or the fringe starts to look a lot less fringe, and so the vibe is sort of shifting underneath your feet a little bit. And so how do you defend an evangelicalism that isn't really a static thing? You know, it's constantly dynamic. You know, could we say, for example, I'm just as a thought experiment, could evangelicalism, I mean, maybe you would just say it would cease to be evangelicalism without a knowable center. But let's say that, you know, the fringe in 30 years is now the center. Would we be able to defend that evangelicalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'd want to say a couple things. One, because I do want to say that something like the Bebbington emphasis on like those 4 emphases, like that's something that you can look at evangelicalism today in America. You can look at evangelicalism like somewhere in Africa right now. You can look at evangelicalism 200 years in the past, and you can see those same 4 emphases. So 30 years from now, if what we currently call evangelicalism in America has changed so much that those are not the emphases, then yeah, maybe we do want to say this has turned into something else. Like, you know, new movements emerge in church history. That's possible. And again, we are talking about emphases, right? So like Catholics also believe in the cross. Saying that evangelicals emphasize the cross is not saying they don't believe that. But like if you go to their church on Sunday, they're going to emphasize the Eucharist in a way that evangelicals generally don't. And so for that kind of transformation to happen, it doesn't even necessarily mean that the people in that scenario don't believe in the cross anymore. It's that they have started emphasizing other things. And if they did that so much, at some point we might say, yeah, I think this is a new thing. This is something different. We're not talking about evangelicalism anymore. I would also say, though, that, you know, the book could have been titled In Defense of Evangelicals as opposed to evangelicalism. I think it doesn't sound as good. But for me, it is really significantly about the people. And I talk in the very end of the book about my friend and former colleague Daniel Silliman gave an example of evangelicalism being like Walmart. And
yes, that was so good.
It's so good. It's so good. I had to do a big block quote of him. But he says, like, you know, when you go to Whole Foods. And I'm like, this is so true.
You're a whole,
you go to
like you're a Whole
Foods, you're
Foods
like,
shopper.
this is so lovely. It's so nice. And you're thinking about, if you're honest with yourself, like, what a lovely class of people are in here. Like, we are like nice, smart folks buying good quality food, and it's like so tasteful. And you go to Walmart and it's like, wow, that like everybody's at Walmart. There's some crazy people here. And Daniel says, like, you know what, evangelicalism is like the Walmart of Christianity. Like, yes, everybody is here. And that's good. Like, as much as even, you know, he says, and I would say of myself also, like, I think some of my worst moments, like, I would love to not be inconvenienced by that. And because, you know, saying I want to defend these people does not mean I never find them annoying. It doesn't mean I think they're right about everything. It doesn't mean I don't, like, sometimes want to take them to task for something, right? Like, that's not what that means. It does mean, though, that evangelicalism as it exists in America right now, these are my people. And when I look around at like those other branches of the church that we were just talking about, there are many goods there as well. There are many wonderful things there. My kids go to an Orthodox school, and I'm thrilled with how much they are learning about like church history and saints that they wouldn't have gotten most likely from our branch of the church. And so like we can benefit each other there. But when I think about like, what is the branch of the church that fostered my faith and that taught me about Jesus and that I feel like at home in? Yeah, it is evangelicalism.
Well, let's talk about the three books, like the three main books that will probably get you into the hottest, deepest water, right?
I think two of them, but we'll see how it goes.
Oh, okay. Well, which two
I don't
do you think?
I don't know that Tim Alberta
is
as big of a debater.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Kristen, did you say, how do you say her? Is it Kobe's?
I think it's I thought it was Kobe's. If I'm mispronouncing that, I'm going to feel terrible, but I think she had it spelled out, like phonetically spelled out, and that's what I remembered, so I hope I'm not wrong.
Okay. Kristen Kobe's Dumais, Jesus and John Wayne, which I have to confess I never managed to read.
I do actually recommend reading it. Like, as much as I have critiques for it, there's a lot of good info in there. I think it's a good read.
Well, I think let's just start there. We don't have to like list all of them right now, but from what I remember of essentially like your premise, the premise of your opposition to that book is like lots of true facts and a wrong story, and it's so why don't you just kind of distill what you find wanting in her account?
I think that's a really good summary. You know, as far as I can tell from myself, as far as I can tell from, you know, even like critical reviews I've read of the book, I don't have any reason to think that she's not like a good historian. Certainly, I think she's a compelling writer. Like it's very interesting. It's a page turner, like, especially by the standards of a like several 100-page history book. So yeah, my critique is very much not about her as a historian. It is much more about when she kind of puts on her pundit cap and draws these big sweeping conclusions about American evangelicalism. And I think that there are some common patterns in how that happens. Some of them are about, you know, like holding evangelicals to a standard to which others are not held. I think Alan Jacobs talks about this, not specifically about her, but talks about this in the foreword of like having an isolated standard of rigor for one group that you dislike, that you don't apply to other people. You know, for instance, Dumais repeatedly talks about like, why don't evangelicals vote for their fellow Christians for president when those Christians are Democrats? You know, she talks about it with Jimmy Carter, she talks about it with Barack Obama, she talks about it with Hillary Clinton. And it's like, well, because they have some pretty serious ethical disagreements that flow into policy questions where these folks have made their positions clear. And why aren't you asking the same question about, you know, why don't progressive Episcopalians vote for George W. Bush when he's their fellow Christian? It's clearly, like, we understand why they don't, because they take political things seriously and they have views that matter to them. And well, so do evangelicals. So there's that pattern. I think there's also a pattern, and this goes to what you were just asking about the fringe becoming the center, where in cases where the fringe is not the center, Dumais will speak as if kind of they are, and kind of you can't tell the difference. So sometimes she explicitly says, like, it's hard to tell the difference. And one example that I think is really helpful to think about there is she talks about two evangelical men's conferences in like the late 90s, early 2000s era. One of them is Promise Keepers, which I'm sure probably everyone here listening has heard of. Even I'd heard of it as like a small child. I mean, everybody knows
That makes
Promise
me
Keepers.
really, I feel a little bit old. You were a small child. I was a new professional.
In the 90s, I was a child, yes. What makes me feel old is when I can tell people can't remember the Bush era, because that was like when I became aware politically. But no, like Promise Keepers made national headlines. Like it was very well known. They were packing stadiums with men. And it was, a couple years into it, their big focus became racial reconciliation. And you see pictures of like black men and white men just in tears hugging each other in these stadium events. Now, I'm sure Promise Keepers was imperfect. I think there are all kinds of questions we can ask about like how much did this moment of catharsis and like reconciliation go home with them to their communities? Like, was it durable? Like, there are all these kinds of questions we can ask. Fair enough. But the fact is that the big evangelical men's event that everybody knew about was trying to do racial reconciliation, and that was a good thing. Then there's this other event she talks about. It was called God Men. It was another men's conference. I think it was around 2007. It was crude. It was men singing songs about like testicles. Very different experience. And Dumais writes as if these are kind of like equal representation of evangelical men's culture from that 90s and early 2000s era. She says like it's the fringe, the center, it's hard to tell the difference. But God Men was like over within a year. It had a few events of a few hundred people. Maybe 10 events on the high end, and then it kind of just petered out and isn't a thing, and probably no one listening has ever heard of it or knows anyone who went to it. Nothing on the scale of Promise Keepers. So like, yes, God Men seems like it was gross and bad, and I would have been disappointed if I was, an adult then and my husband or my sons had gone to it. I would have been very unhappy about that. But to level it with Promise Keepers is just misleading.
What's so interesting to me, I don't know, has there been, I feel like there's been a lot of credulity on the behalf of evangelicals. I would just say in general, that when people level critiques about us, we just sort of like roll over and say, I know, aren't we bad? And I'm sure that's not true of everyone. But I feel like I haven't read a lot of critiques of Jesus and John Wayne. I feel like, and you even say in your book that to fly in the face of her own argument, she's very graciously received by many evangelical podcast hosts. And
that was so fascinating. She's talked about and this is not a one-off thing. She's talked about this, I think I found in at least 3 different places, that the reception from specifically, by her account, white, conservative, complementarian, evangelical men has been grace upon grace, that they have brought her on their podcast. In one case, she even mentions, I think, 2 men who lost their jobs in part because of their advocacy of her book. And it's just like, if that's the reception, is the thesis right? Like that evangelical men are so, aggressively misogynist and masculine and like trampling down other people. Obviously there are evangelicals who have responded like virulently to her in ways that are totally inappropriate and like grotesque. But the fact that there was such a pattern of that reception, I think should tell us something. Let's
go to Beth Allison Barr's Making of Biblical Womanhood.
Sure.
What's wanting in her story?
Yeah, I think she writes from a little bit of a different position from Dumais. I know they're good friends. I think Dumais does not necessarily see herself as inside evangelicalism as much as Barr does. And so Barr does write with more of an eye to reform and to making things better. And I really appreciate that about her. I think I differ with her on whether her approach is going to succeed in that, but like I appreciate that that's what she's trying to do. I would say it's some of the same kind of patterns of like, I'm not doubting the scholarship, but like some of the sweeping conclusions. And also with her in particular, a narrative of like sort of things are the same as they've ever been around women in Christianity. So like I'm an egalitarian. Like I agree with many of her views, like even down to some specific interpretations of Bible passages. But when she says things like, the one that stands out most to me is she talks about telling her students, she's a professor down in Texas, she talks about telling her students how in, I think it's ancient Mesopotamia, I want to think it was Babylon, but I might be getting that wrong. If a husband suspected his wife of adultery, not even proved, he's allowed to drown her. And this is like the law, this is the accepted custom in this like horrifically violent and misogynist ancient pagan society. And she likens this to her, she says she likens this to her Texas college students. She says she likens this to living as a woman in Texas today. I'm sorry, I think that there's actually a really big difference between it being legal to murder your wife because you think she might have cheated on you and like whatever the flaws of the justice system in Texas, we do actually think it's a crime if you murder your wife or you beat her or you abuse her in any way today. And so just to speak about it as if like the patriarchy is just as bad as ever and women are just as oppressed as ever and like as if Christianity did not do enormous things for how women exist in this world. I don't think we should level those two things. Like admit the bad, there are still plenty of bad things that we could be calling out, but like don't miss the good also.
And then Tim Alberta, that's the last one, which I did read that. The other two I have not read, the Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which I read. I guess I read that. Did that come out in 2021 or 2? Maybe 2022, because that's when we came back to the United States from Canada. So I felt like we'd been away for 11 years. So the whole first Trump presidency, then the Biden years, and well, halfway through his presidency. And then I'm like, I have to refamiliarize myself with kind of the landscape. And then you read Tim Alberta's book and it's horrible, the narrative that he paints. And I mean, he has a very personal story. So are you more sympathetic to his account, or do you find that he's actually making the exact same mistakes as you?
No, I think in some ways his account is more nuanced. Something I love about his book is he travels around and he talks to people. Some of the interviews he does with Robert Jeffress down at Dallas First Baptist, like the things he gets that man to say to him is just like incredible work. The thing with, and Alberta too, I believe he's in seminary now. Like he's very much still in the church. I know he was at least talking about going to seminary at one point. I think he is. He's very much still in the church. I don't know if he's planning on going into ministry or what. But he has, he interviews, and to my recollection, he kind of presents them as like a remnant, but he interviews very prominent evangelicals who are very opposed to like the gross God and country stuff that he's talking about. People like my colleague Russell Moore, people like David French, people like Brian Zond. And these tend to be people like who I have worked with or whose work I've benefited from. Like I'm very much aligned with them. He also really interestingly talks to some pastors, like local pastors, who have had people kind of lose their minds over politics in their own church. And he reports that like there's one particularly interesting passage where he's talking to like I think a pastor, maybe a couple pastors and a seminary professor who maybe goes to one of their churches, and they say like, there is this small minority of people who like really got out of hand during the last few years. But it's really not many of them. And also, even some of the people who did kind of lose their mind about politics, like those are the ones who are first in line to work the soup kitchen. Like those are the ones who are most enthusiastic in helping meet these basic needs in our community. And so, yeah, like I think their politics are nuts, but like they are still faithfully contributing to our church life. And so I think what I found frustrating about Alberta's book is that he reports on that nuance. Like he finds it. He does the work to find the complication there and share that in a really beautiful way. But then when he's writing like sort of these more argument driven and conclusion passages, it's all pretty down on like the prospects of anything good happening here when he's seen the good himself. And I'm sympathetic because of particularly the time that he was writing. Like I get that. And I would love to know if he would adjust some of that conclusion drawing today. But yeah, I think that the balance of his more negative conclusions isn't supported by his own reporting. As much as some of what he has in there is truly horrifying, like if you look at who he talks to and what he has as a whole, I think I at least read that and come to a more complicated and positive place than he does.
Well, thanks for, what do you anticipate their reactions to be to your book?
I don't know. I'm very interested to see. I think what I really hope does not happen, and I don't know if this would come from them so much as sort of like the way that the internet works. What I hope doesn't happen is that does not exist in people's minds as like a personal fight. Particularly, I think people love to do like a cat fight narrative between two women. Super not trying to do that. Like I have no reason to think that these are anything but like competent scholars and lovely people, and I would be perfectly happy to like, I don't know, do a joint event or something. Like that's all fine. I just think that they drew some wrong conclusions and that they are part of I mean the phrase that other people have used and I think I've used also, it's something of a cottage industry of writing about how bad evangelicals are. That at a certain point, like it has grown to such a size that I felt compelled to say, like, no, like, wait a minute, is this really the situation?
Interesting. Well, I definitely felt like, again, a bit of the relief that we talked about earlier, like, oh, that's right, we're not all that bad. And a little bit of a rebuke, like, wait, what has made me so credulous for the kind of larger narrative that I get in media when in my own church, I have exactly the experience that you were describing. Like these are lovely people. I do also think that it can exist. I'd be curious what you think about this. This is almost like a side question, but I've heard people narrate like the people in my church that are lovely, but then I see a version of them online that is unrecognizable.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I talk about this some in the book, talking about, I think I called it like an inverse hypocrisy, where when people are dealing face to face with someone, they're loving, they're gracious, how can they help? But then when they shift into that political mode and think about like a group of people who are like political rivals or in some way disfavored, sort of in that abstract, like politics brain, like some of the things that come out of your mouth, it's like, oh my, please stop. Please don't say these things. I think that that's real. I also would say that while there are ways in which that is perhaps characteristic of American evangelicalism, just because of how we do tend to be so individualistic, and we do, like, for better and worse. Like, I think there's a lot of good things about individualism, like individual rights, but there are some ways in which that's characteristic of us. But I also always think that's characteristic of Americans. Like, we are all really bad at politics right now, and so I want to distinguish between, like, there are cases where, do evangelicals deserve critique for XYZ? Yes, and so does everybody else in this country, or so do all Christians, or like. That's fallen human nature. So like locating the source of the problem, I think, is important for fairness, yes, but also like to fix that problem. You're not going to fix it if you're attributing it to the thing that didn't cause it.
Right.
Yeah.
And you make the argument in the book that from the research, from the data, evangelicals are actually a lot less politically engaged and politically informed than we imagine them to be. So I'd be curious if you would just tell us a little bit about that. And also, in order to kind of fix some of the problems that we're seeing, should we be more informed? Like, what do you tell the average evangelical?
Read the news more.
Get online more. No, it kind of feels like, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So first on like the fact side of things, with all due grains of salt about what people tell pollsters and what people actually live, right? But that's all polls. Right. It's not just unique to evangelicals. But yeah, I mean, evangelicals are pretty clear when you ask them, like, do you want your pastor to be out here endorsing politicians and like telling you how to vote from the pulpit? They say no. And one of the really, I mean, like going beyond what people will just say, I believe it was Pew, did an analysis of actual sermons, not just of evangelicals, but across a number of Christian traditions, because people have put everything online now. So they did an analysis of the text of the audio of these sermons, and it is really actually super rare. Like, I think many people outside evangelicalism have this idea that like we're filing in the last Sunday in October and the pastor's like ticking off who you're going to vote for. And it's just not like that. And people don't want it to be like that. And this is demonstrable with not just anecdotes, but like polling data. So I think there is that. There's a gap there in between perception and reality. And that's not to say that, I think where you're most often to get politics from the pulpit, quote unquote, it tends to be much more around those ethical issues, especially life ethics and ethics of sex and gender, that do have a foot in both camps. Like, undeniably, that stuff, you're going to run into those topics in scripture. Even if you're not trying to preach on it and you're just like going straight through books of the Bible, you're going to get on that stuff. And it is obviously part of our politics right now. So I think it's important to think about, like, when there is politicking in church, like, what do we actually see? What is the actual situation? Because that's quite a different thing from saying, go vote for this guy. As far as like recommending, I think that many people have, I was just talking about individualism. I think many people have kind of rightly imbibed a caution about hyper-individualist solutions of like, you just go, be more loving in your church. You just go pray more. You just go read the Bible more. I understand, it's like the thoughts and prayers critique, like, okay, but are you really doing anything, right? I understand why people react against that. And I do think there are many cases where we could stand to be thinking more about like structures and like, how have we organized our society, not just what am I personally doing. But what I would challenge people who are pushing back on sort of like the be more evangelical, go to church more, read your Bible more recommendations that I make in the book is to think about realistically, what can you do? So like I think about that pastor that I mentioned earlier, who likes Trump's border policies and is helping illegal immigrants along the border, like tangibly helping them. He is one dude with one vote. He has a full-time job as a pastor. Like he is busy in his community. There is literally no way that he is going to go change Trump's border policies. That is outside his control. He can't do anything. Doesn't matter how much he reads the news. Doesn't even matter if he changes his mind and decides he wants open borders. Nothing will change. What will change is if he goes and provides that meal. Like that is something he can actually do. And so I think, we have made it into a virtue to be aware and like have thoughts about Washington, D.C. in your head, but in real life, that doesn't usually do that much. And there's this really wonderful C.S. Lewis quote that I'm going to read, because I don't have it memorized. It comes from one of his letters, I forget to whom, but he says, I think each village was meant to feel pity for its own sick and poor whom it can help, and I doubt if it is the duty of any private person to fix his mind on ills which he cannot help. This may even become an escape from the works of charity we really can do to those we know. A great many people, not you, do now seem to think that the mere state of being worried is in itself meritorious. I don't think it is. We must, if it so happens, give our lives for others. But even while we're doing it, I think we're meant to enjoy our Lord, and in him, our friends, our food, our sleep, our jokes, and the bird's song and the frosty sunrise. And so I think that like that is true of us as well. If you are, I don't know, in the cabinet of the president, maybe your situation is different and you do, like, as an evangelical, you need to do something else. But if you are like Joe in the pews, read the Bible more, go to church more, sign up for another ministry. Like, I think that is going to be far more meaningful, and far more formative of us to hopefully close that gap between how we behave individually and what happens sometimes when we switch into that politics brain. I think that's going to do way more to help that than switching into the politics brain more often.
And you might also be able to participate in something local in terms of your local politics. Because I'll just we can end our conversation here, but you told this amazing story about my city. So actually, I'm going to let you tell it. Do you remember, Bonnie?
Did you know the story already?
I did not know the story. Okay. No.
So there's other people who have done much fuller accounts of this. I think I told it in about a paragraph, but basically it was this large, I think a mega church in Cincinnati. And they had been doing a curriculum about, it's a predominantly white church, I think predominantly like middle to upper middle class, very evangelical. They'd been doing a curriculum about racial reconciliation, in, I believe, many of their small groups, something like that. And so around the time that they're doing it, this local, I think it was a ballot initiative, came up about, do we want to have a new tax, I believe is what it is, to fund universal preschool? Does that sound right?
Yes. Yes, it was.
And the preschool, like the preschool program would have disproportionately, because of where they're located, it would have disproportionately helped Black residents in the area, lower income people. And the church, the people in the church who were hot off this curriculum, they were like, we should support this. And it was because of, like, to my understanding, like, because it's such a large church, their involvement is thought to have made the difference in why this passed. Now, these people did not, like, change all their politics, right? They're still conservative white evangelicals. Like, this is not going to make them be different people. It's not going to take them out of their context, but like they're really, they're doing this in good faith. Like it's not an act. It's not like a plot. Sometimes the way people talk about evangelicals sounds so conspiratorial. Like we're just pretending to be into the Bible. Like, no, they were really into it. And they were really, I'm sure that they were probably like flawed and awkward, and like maybe things got weird and maybe things didn't stick as long as they should have, but they did this study and they wanted to put it into practice and they found something and they did.
Yeah. And it made a meaningful difference in the city. So it was such a beautiful story. I was really, really glad to learn about it. So thank you, Bonnie, for writing In Defense of Evangelicalism. I do also like the alternative title, In Defense of Evangelicals. Yeah. But, I like this one too. Yeah. And I hope that many will read it and reconsider some of their own antipathies and sort of reflexive abhorrence for evangelicals, whether they're insiders or outsiders. So thanks for joining me today to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you so much.